Welcome, Aussie, back to the McIntyre Report. I wanted to firstly talk to you a little bit before we get into the Ukraine-Russia conflict situation. What's your views on the Syria? What's going on in Syria? Who was behind this? What's your take?
Well, we can start with who benefits from the Syrian situation. And clearly, it's not the Syrian people. It's not Syrian civilians who are being slaughtered and massacred and beheaded and terrorized. Unfortunately, it looks like the Syrian government was not putting up any fight. And I'd say that there's probably a deal made. And look, with no offense to the Syrian people or their interests, but I highly suspect, and I've been saying this for the last few weeks, that there would have been a deal on the table between Trump and Putin. Something on the lines of, give us Ukraine, we'll give you Syria. But at the same time, Trump publicly maintains that he's got no interest in Syria and American troops will not be going on the ground, although they've been there for a long time. American troops occupying and guarding oil resources, which they've been pumping illegally in Syria for a long time. But I often thought that you couldn't solve the Ukraine situation without a deal solving the Syrian situation. Of course, the winner in the Syrian situation at the moment is not the Syrian people. It's hard to say who a winner is here. Russia still maintains its bases. So Russia is, in a way, not worse off, but at least they don't have to prop up the Syrian regime financially and militarily. I mean, Russia pumped a lot of money into the Syrian government. I shouldn't say regime, sorry, that's a Western term. The Syrian legitimate Assad government, whatever you think of him, he was a legitimate government up until he left the country. But Russia spent a lot of resources, including caliber missiles, cruise missiles, troops, blood, elite Russian troops who fought for a long time to hold off all of the different factions in Syria. And now Syria is going to become like Libya was after Gaddafi was murdered, again, at the behest of NATO. And Hillary Clinton was very pleased when Gaddafi was murdered on the streets brutally. Probably they would have done the same to Assad, except Assad managed to take asylum in Russia, and the Russian government, President Putin, personally granted him asylum. That doesn't mean that the Russian government necessarily condoning or supporting him to the end, because clearly even the Syrian embassy in Moscow has raised the new green so-called moderate rebel flag, and looks like the Russian government is dealing with them. I mean, we've seen interactions between the Syrian rebels and Russian military convoys in Syria, and they don't seem to be shooting at each other. So even those old Syrian rebels and all the old Syrian people and troops and different militant factions, they have respect for the Russian flag when they see a Russian military convoy moving around Syria. Question is, will the Syrian new leadership, which has been called a terrorist government, terrorist leadership, illegitimate leadership, will they interact with the Russians? In what manner? Will they let the Russians keep their bases? Because the Russians have had those bases for decades and decades. I still think the Syrian people feel good towards the Russians, but it is a shock. It is a shame, and the victims of all of this will be Syrian people, Syrian civilians, Syrian Christians, Syrian different, even Muslims, Shias, and others. Anyone who all of these different groups. You've got Kurds, you've got Turkish-backed proxies, you've got ISIS, you've got Al-Qaeda, you've got CIA-funded militants. It's a mess. So in a way, as a Russian patriot, I'm sort of happy that Russia is not going to be tied down there anymore. Because what did that bring us? Who said thank you to us? We've seen some commentators are saying, oh, Russia abandoned us. Or did the Syrian army stand its ground? Did it fight? I don't really think so. Whether they were ordered to step down or to stand down, should I say, or the leadership was bribed, or the CIA bought them off. It doesn't look like the Syrian military did a good job in stopping this. And those Syrian soldiers who didn't want to fight, they're now being hunted down in hospital beds, in their houses, on the streets. You should have fought. You should have fought when you had the opportunity. And it just felt like a domino set, the whole situation, which is similar to what could happen in Ukraine, really. So if the Ukrainian military now, if they cut Zelensky's funding, if Trump enters and cuts Zelensky's funding, which he has said numerous occasions, I mean, he's got people like Elon Musk around him and others who have already said that enough is enough. They cut Zelensky's funding. The soldiers aren't being paid. the officers aren't being paid, the money stops. What's going to happen? The military might turn and march on Zelensky. That would be a good scenario. And I think that's what Russia's waiting for, because they know, and we all know, everyone knows that a regime change can happen in the space of 24 hours to 48 hours to 72 hours. You don't have to fight the army. You don't have to fight the Air Force. You don't have to fight their tanks and their troops, where it can all be done within. And who are the specialists at that? It's the Americans. The Americans never fight man-to-man, hand-to-hand. They're the specialists at organizing regime changes and color revolutions and handing out cookies in Georgia or in Ukraine, or wherever it is, on Maidan, in the Middle East, in Africa, and Southeast Asia, and South America. They do it everywhere, all over the world. And that's where the Russians need to take more of a example from the Americans. It's much cheaper and easier to spend money on cookies and paying protesters to simulate democratic protesting and a regime change process than it is to put tens of thousands of tanks onto the battlefield and fight the old-fashioned way. But at least the Russians are honest, right? The Russians are fighting honestly. They don't meddle in other countries like the CIA and the Americans do. But certainly, I think we can see with Georgia, for example, the Russians have said, no, we're not going to tolerate this. And Romania, for example, again, a sympathetic government is elected in Romania. What does the CIA do? Said, no way, we can't accept that. And they create a situation where they declare the elections illegitimate. Who gave them that right? The Romanian people made their choice. The Romanian people are Orthodox Christians, right? Same with the Russians. They're close to the Russians. They don't want to fight the Russians. So it's natural there's a pro-Russian government. In Romania, in Moldova, in Hungary, it's natural, right? They're actually pro-Russian sentiment is very strong in Poland also, right? And in Germany, especially East Germany, in those Eastern German areas where the Soviet Union used to occupy, there's pro-Russian sentiment is extremely strong. So there's pro-Russian sentiment everywhere at the moment. Slovakia, for example, Fico, he's openly talking against Zelensky. No more funding, no NATO, nothing. And Fico has declared, after recovering from his assassination, he's now making bold statements, harder than ever, stronger than ever, supporting Russia, saying that next year, for the 80th anniversary of the Russian Soviet victory day over Nazi Germany, 9th of May 1945, it's 80 years next year, Fico said he's coming to the Red Square for the military parade. So things are looking up. Russia has been patient. Putin's tactic of patience, of self-control, of responsible governance and responsible military strategy, it has now shown that it's paying off. It's paying off. Russia is going to withstand all of this. It has withstood all of this. The hardest pressure and the hardest challenges are already behind Russia. If they were going to crack or collapse or something was going to happen, it would have happened in 2022, 23. We're now moving into 2025 in a few days, and Russia is stronger than ever, more resilient than ever. The Russian economy is prepared. The Russian military is prepared. We're churning out missiles. No one can match the Russian Oreshnik missile. Nobody in the world has anything similar to this. They all talk about, what if Russia uses nukes, but they won't dare to use nukes because using nukes is a big escalation. Well, using 10 Oreshnik missiles is similar to using a nuclear weapon in its effect, its yield, its megaton yield. And that's not a nuclear weapon. So Russia has these conventional means. The State Department yesterday said that they suspect Russia will unleash another Oreshnik missile strike. Russia will probably warn Ukraine, we're going to hit this area, so evacuate the people, which is what the Russians do. Again, because the Russians don't want to kill civilians. The Russians don't see the Ukrainians as their enemies. The Russians see the Ukrainians as brothers who have been temporarily blinded, like a parasite has entered your brain and is controlling you. That's what's happened to the Ukrainian people. Some Nazis backed by Victoria Nuland and the CIA and Hillary Clinton and the neocons and the globalists have got into power and have enslaved 42 million Ukrainians. There used to be. Now there's only 23 million of them. Where have they all gone? They've either been killed, wounded, sold. Sold as in for organs or child trafficking or prostitutes into the brothels of Europe and Turkey and Dubai and everywhere else. And the men have been sent to die. What's left of the Ukrainian people? 23 million. 6 million have entered Russia as refugees because they love Russia. and there's millions more that live in the territories which now Russia has liberated, and those territories are now part of Russia forever. There can be no discussion of Russia giving back any territories. Every meter of that land in Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk People's Republics is soaked with the blood of Russian soldiers, just as it was in World War I and World War II, all the time. And Russians have shown that they will fight. And this is what the West has now. The West has a bigger problem. That what do they do with Russia? What do you do with Russia now? Even if there is a deal, there's a settlement, like Trump says, I'll settle this in the first 24 hours. I'll stop the war. I'll settle it. Okay, let's say he does settle it. What are you going to do then with the Russian military, with the Russian country, the people? You've got so many Russian heroes. You've got so many people in the army. You've got the army is 2 million men strong now. You've got the Russian military-industrial complex pumping out tanks, pumping out planes, pumping out jets, pumping out missiles. What are you going to do with that? That's the question the West has to ask. And Russia wouldn't have done this. Russia wouldn't have been so strong if it wasn't for provocating, if it wasn't for poking the bear. The West has itself to blame that they created a military superpower again out of Russia. You see what happened in the 1990s? Western advisors came into Russia, fooled Gorbachev and Yeltsin and convinced them to take on American values. And they literally convinced them, they paid them, they bribed them. Destroy your missiles, cut your bombers, cut your long-range bombers. I mean, cut as in literally take it to a scrapyard and cut it in half and melt it down, melting down weapons, taking apart military bases, taking apart submarines for scrap metal. This is what they did. And they were very clever, these advisors from Washington. And they, in exchange, they provided Coca-Cola, McDonald's, the Western values, Hollywood, blue jeans, bubblegum. And of course, the Soviet Russians, who were fresh from the Soviet Union, they were temporary blinded bowlers. They thought, oh, this is fantastic. Finally, I can listen to Elvis Presley on a cassette recorder, and I can have a pair of blue jeans. And they thought this is great, but it's all temporary. It's nonsense, as we all know. It's not actually a good thing. And Russians have figured out now that they were tricked. And now the Russians figured out they were tricked, things are returning to how they used to be. I'm not talking about the communism factor. I'm talking about the staunchness factor, the patriotism factor. I don't care what flag Russia is under, whether it's a monarchist white, gold, and black flag, or it's a Soviet red flag with a hammer and a sickle, or it's a white, blue, red flag of the Russian Federation. What I care about is that the rest of the world fears Russia, especially the United States, and they won't dare raise their hand at Russia, strategically, militarily, politically, economically. And this is where Russia has got the initiative. They've done a good job, they've held the line, and now they're in a prime position for any future war. Imagine if there was no special military operation. Imagine how underprepared the Russian military would be today in 2025, right? Of course, it cost blood, it cost experience and mistakes, but that experience of war has now created Russia into this very serious military superpower. The one country, number one country in the world, who is facing everything NATO has, all NATO drones, all NATO missiles being shot down, Storm Shadows shot down, ATACMS shot down, HIMARS intercepted, electronic warfare. Russia is number one now. Dealing with NATO intelligence, tactics, troop movements, armor, destroying Abrams tanks, capturing Abrams tanks, destroying Challenger tanks from the British, capturing them, destroying Leopard tanks, Leopard 2 tanks from the Germans, capturing them. And of course, capturing all of these weapons and these missiles intact from the West, and then giving them over, sharing them with their allies, sharing these captured trophies with countries like Iran and China, who are able to reverse engineer and get the best out of Western technology. So that's where the West loses, that the Russians now have an extremely strong advantage for any future conflict. The Ukraine-Russia conflict, or the Ukraine-NATO conflict against Russia, because that's what it was a NATO conflict, that's just the beginning. This is a warm-up. And guess who is in the correct prime position? Morale is at an all-time high. Patriotism is at an all-time high. The country is rallying around the president, rallying around the military. What's happening in the United States, in the UK, in Australia? Demilitarized, no more weapons, no more ammunition, no more missiles, no more soldiers. Nobody wants to fight. Nobody wants to join. Nobody wants to fight the Russians. The Russians are ready to fight anyone. The Russians have got strong allies. Iran, China, North Korea. The North Koreans are itching to get into the fight. And they're begging Putin, let us get in there. We'll send 1 million of our boys in. Putin's saying, it's all right, I don't need you, but thanks for the offer. We're friends.